Thank you, Peter, for being here. And you started collecting really young. For most of the collectors I know, you started as a teenager. How did that come about?
Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody. Looks like a nice crowd. Dog back there, welcome as well. And yeah, I started at a very young age collecting, and I can't really explain why. I just my father, came from Europe, and he was not interested really in sports like I was, and he was very interested in art, and he, liked to try to collect French Rococo paintings, and I sort of shared kind of collecting coins and watching him, try to figure out what artist did what painting, and my father and I were very close, and so that was kind of very nurturing for me to spend all that time with him. And he was really an academic, and again, didn't really care for sports, and didn't really take me to baseball games unless I begged, and but he was a great guy, and I owe a lot to him.
And I'm thinking about, what has made you the collector that you are today, and I think that this relationship, this first relationship for art, is key to a lot of the relationships and the way you are a natural teacher as well about art. It's the relationship. It was a way of bonding with your father, and he must have been. He was probably, as you are to others, in talking about the work and what he liked about it. Was it emphasizing connoisseurship or this idea of always going for the best? What was his approach?
I don't really think so. I think that he was a hard-working man who had, a very small manufacturing business, and he came from Europe. His father was, fairly well off there. He was, middle class businessman there, and my mother's parents were also European, and so he worked very hard, and his way of, splurging or expressing himself was to buy paintings that reminded him of Europe and reminded him of earlier times, and it was based really on what he liked. The connoisseurship was limited, but he loved going to museums, and he took me to museums. I must have been a visitor at the Frick 50 times, and so that, that helped me a lot.
Any particular Rococo that you particularly liked at that age?
Yeah, I liked it. He was a collector of. He liked Jean-Baptiste Greuze a lot.
Okay.
Greuze was, of course, did Benjamin Franklin's portrait, and he was, he'd met, he'd met the Americans who came over, like Franklin and Jefferson, and so he liked that work a lot, and he did have one, Greuze, which we had in our house for, many, many years.
How do you get from old master paintings to collecting contemporary and modern?
Well, I think I think it was rare for somebody my age in America to because kind of in the 50s, there was a limitation to art in the United States. I mean, everybody, was very encouraged by going to museums and seeing European art, but there wasn't really abstract expressionism didn't really, take a hold until later, even though the artists were working, and they obviously all were struggling. But I think that what happened was that I started to look a lot because I was going with my dad to the Met and to to the Museum of Modern Art, and so I got to see a lot. And then because I knew something about classical art, it was, being rare, I got to talk to a lot of older people who were maybe involved in the art world. And then, my parents liked to ski a lot, and they would go to, they'd save up to go to Europe once a year to, ski in Switzerland. And once I was 10, they would take me with them on Christmas break, and we would, meet a lot of different people there. And I became very friendly with Bruno Bischofberger, who was about 10 years older than me, 11 years older than me, but was already a young, successful dealer. And he kind of convinced me when I was sort of I met him when I was 15.
Wow.
And he convinced me that, it was nice to know about classical art, but that really, I lived in New York, and I really should spend my time looking at the work that was being done in New York in the early 60s. And, and he introduced me to Leo Castelli. So I met Leo, and I spent a lot of time with Leo. He was kind of reminded me of my dad a lot.
Yeah.
They had similar backgrounds. So that's kind of how I started with Andy's work and Roy Lichtenstein's work, and Jasper and Rauschenberg, and so I was very taken at that age. And so once I was 17, and I somehow came across some funds, I invested it in art.
And Warhol was one of the first works you bought.
Yeah, Warhol was one of the first. And I liked France. I really, very much liked Henry Moore when I first, started. I saw a family group that I thought was, fabulous, but I wasn't radical for somebody like Bischofberger, so he didn't really care for it as much. But Bruno, it kind of introduced me to a lot of very interesting artists, Carl Andre, Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, really, at that time, it was pretty tough stuff.
I just watched a recent video with Bischofberger, and talking about the collaboration between Warhol and Basquiat, and how much he facilitated that. And I was struck because I know how much you also, in your relationship with artists, and particularly with Warhol, was a facilitator for his work. First of all, you were collecting his work. You had quite a bit of his work before you, and Warhol's a good place for us to start because the show is coming up, but also he really is the cornerstone of your collecting. You were collecting several works. How did you end up meeting him?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that some of the greatest works I think that we collected, I really collected at a very early age of like 18, 19 years old. I mean, it's not that I just started there and then it emerged I emerged as a collector and started to come up with master works. Some of my best works were the ones that I bought then. Now, I continued to like hunt for great works, but you had to be, by that time, you needed much more of a financial resource to acquire those works. So I guess it's fair to say that if I chose like 4 or 5 of the greatest works we have, or 10 of the greatest works we have, probably 3 or 4 of them would have been bought when I was between 17 and 20.
We have some of our teens in the audience today from our teen program, so I'm sure you were, and I can tell you they have that ability already. So I'm glad that you give them that encouragement. Part of it was, so what year was this? This would have been early 60s?
67.
Okay, so when Warhol first shows the soup cans in LA at Ferris, 1963, all the soup cans, only one sold. So in a way, some of the artists were doing their most innovative new work. It was all new work at the time, and it was available because people hadn't started collecting in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like for younger people that are out there, I mean, it's just, when you're collecting work like that, the probability is that you're going to meet people that think they know a lot about art and probably have studied art, and they're going to look at you and say, you're out of your mind to collect that, because normally very radical things that are really changing the art world are very difficult for people to embrace, because they're used to looking at Impressionist paintings, or they're used to looking at old master paintings, or, I mean, at that time, even Cubist paintings were considered pretty radical, and they'd been done 50 years or 40 years before. So I think that if you're in a place where serious art is being done, and it's hard for people to take that work, you ought to look at it double, you ought to look at it more, because it might be really great. And it just bothers other people because it's radical and might say radical things. And so in the case of Andy Warhol, it was pop art. I mean, he wasn't just a pop artist, he was a great artist. He was a great portrait artist, but he was very influenced by pop culture, by reading newspapers and magazines, and he was, drew like an old master draftsman, but he was introducing, and he was everything that you shouldn't be as an artist. He was a commercial artist, which was really a taboo at the time, that if you had anything to do with commercialism as an artist in the 60s, that was really in bad taste. So, other artists like Johns and Rauschenberg, they kind of hid from that. If they participated, they disguised the fact that they participated. But Andy was like, he was out there. He was a very wealthy commercial artist. I mean, he was making back then $50,000 to $100,000 a year,
Whoa.
which was really
That's amazing.
a lot, as a very successful commercial artist, doing work for all the magazine companies, drawing shoes for I. Miller, and then he, even though he was very well educated, and he from Pittsburgh, and always had scholarships to schools studying art history, he didn't really start having gallery shows until kind of 56, 57.
What was it that drew you to it? When here you are, 17 years old, people have been collecting, people around aren't doing it, you're doing it. Was it through the relationships with Bishop Berger and Leo Castelli that they opened you to it, or did you catch on to it as soon as you saw it?
No, I didn't catch on to it as soon as I saw it. I really questioned it when I first saw it. I mean, here, like, I was being interested in classical art. I was not really prepared to accept photography as a real art form to create paintings. Silk screening. I didn't really. It took me a while. It took me at least 3-4 years to really understand how great it was. And I had people like Leo and somebody like Brant was a super educated guy, and he had studied art history all of his life up until then, and is one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met as an art historian. So I think when you're circulating with minds like that, brains like that, they can persuade you easier, and so I became a believer. And then a lot of the museums were obviously the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan. They missed that movement, and missing
Big
that
time.
Missing that movement was very costly in a sense to our culture, because a lot of people go to those museums and those paintings were not present. And instead, a lot of the European countries were first to embrace that work, and then, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Scandinavia. So a lot of the great works went to those museums.
It's interesting because these were quintessentially American works.
Yes.
And they go there. Do you think because they had a longer history with photography, as understand an appreciation of the role of photography?
I think they were interested in
American.
And they really, questioned, like, why is this culture so great? And it must have something to do with the art. And they, so they were very inquisitive. And a lot of the German artists and a lot of the, Italian artists were really interested in our work. So I met Andy Warhol in 1968, and unfortunately, in June of '68, I met him in October of '68, but in June of '68 he was shot, same day as Bobby Kennedy was shot.
I don't realize
And he, it was a kind of freak accident. I mean, naturally, he was. And Andy Warhol was a very conservative person, but he was a voyeur, and he was very religious. He liked to go to restaurants and clubs and look at people, kind of like Toulouse-Lautrec would have done.
Yeah, he loved.
In the late 19th century, and it just happened that he decided that he was going to be involved in film because he liked the idea of shooting movies and the handheld camera and no script. So he was picking out people that he thought would be interesting characters, as what he would call superstars. And he was obviously very influenced by the great movie stars of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, very, very kind of glamorous, and the only way he could get that same glamour at that time were sort of the drag queens, the, glamorous makeup people that kind of looked like great movie stars, as far as he was concerned. And so it was an assortment of different characters, and, one of the characters was, this was the lady that shot him. And she just came into the factory and shot, Mario Maya and almost shot Fred Hughes and shot, Andy. And he literally almost died. I mean, he was pronounced dead, and they revived him. So after he was shot, the Andy Warhol that I knew was very frail and very shy, and didn't really want to go out much or, do a whole lot, because the girl that had shot him was let go and she was free. He was always afraid that he was going to bump into her. So Andy in '68, he really had decided that he didn't want to paint anymore, and he wanted to do film. And he wanted to do interview. So I had collected the work before I knew him. because I really liked his work, and I didn't really ever had the chance. When I went to the University of Colorado, I shipped back to New York, and I was not in that scene. I was really, collecting his work, and then Leo introduced me to Andy. The way he introduced me was he said, "Okay, he's heard that you're buying a lot of his paintings, so go to the factory and say hello. He'd like to see you." So I went there, and that's how I met him. And so we spent a lot of time together in the late 60s, most of the 70s. We did some movies together, and we did Interview Magazine together. And Fred Hughes, who became his business manager, had gotten the job from Mrs. Dumenil, and who knew Fred's mother very well. And Fred was a big help to Andy. Mm-hmm. He introduced him to a lot of people, and was really, became his business manager and dealer. So, Andy was the kind of artist that did not have the best representation, because he should have, he would really almost want to deal with anybody that came around. Yeah. And he didn't, so he had dealers all over the world, and a lot of them were competing with one another.
It's hard to imagine today that Warhol was not always superstar Warhol. There was a time in the 80s that there wasn't that much interest in him. I mean, he was Warhol, but there wasn't the kind of recognition there is today. One of the works that you got early was one of the shot Marilyn's.
Yes.
And I don't know if everybody knows it, but what those paintings were, and that one of them broke the all-time record for a sale of a modern, was it a 20th century painting ever? Was it like last year? Yeah. It was the sage shot, the blue sage shot.
Yeah, that.
Yeah. What made that painting? I mean, you got it really early. What makes? Well, why don't you explain first of all, what the story was with those?
Well, I mean, the painting was, Andy Warhol never really achieved, until after he passed, never really achieved the pricing that, Roy Lichtenstein or Jasper Johns or Rauschenberg or any of the abstract expressionists that were well known. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he had this way of explaining his work that he liked. He liked it to be mechanical. He'd like to explain it like, well, we just have this factory and we just make all this stuff, and it's, I don't really have that much to do with it, and I have a whole bunch of people here. It was really like comedy. I mean, he really was involved with everything, and he just didn't like to really talk about his work, and didn't really, he was never, he was never conscious of being able to explain, his work. But he did know how great he was, and he did know that his works were selling for less than his friends, and that, I think, kind of bothered him. But it had to do with, the volume of great work that he made. It's just rare for any artist to do that. So the opportunity was always there to buy it, but people never really, they branded him as a pop artist, and then the pop art became a little bit out of style, so he went out of style, but he really never got out of style. I mean, all his periods are really strong, and it's just the way it is in the art world. There's nothing really definitive. You count anybody out, dead or alive. I mean, it's just what students and people think of the work after you're gone, and while you're alive, and how they study it and how other young artists react to it. So.
And the shot Marilyns were uniquely because of what happened to them, the 5 paintings that were in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I live with the shot Marilyn. It's like a very important thing to me. And somebody came and approached me, just not too long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and tried to, say, well, look, there's got to be a price where you sell this. And I said, well, it would be a great victory maybe in most people's mind to sell something like that, but for me, it would be a defeat. It would be like, this is like one of the most important things that I've ever been associated with, and I love living with it, and I just don't think of it in terms of what it's worth. As a matter of fact, the fact that it's worth more is kind of, it's kind of makes it more awkward, because you have to insure it, and you have to, I think paintings like that ultimately should be in museums and have people, look at them. So it's really not about what one thing is worth or what another thing is worth. If you want to collect and you really feel passionate about it, and it's not just saying, well, I think it looks good, I like the style of it, it looks good over the chair or over the sofa, but really go out there and really study art history, younger art. You can make mistakes, but that passion will develop into something that is meaningful.
You started out collecting for yourself, and I imagine for your home. So at what point did you transition from it being a personal activity to then becoming a public activity, and instead of arranging works in your own home, which are beautiful, also incredible interiors, to creating exhibitions that had a focus and would be educational as well?
I don't know, that's a complicated question, because I've changed a number of times in my life in terms of, I've always have conversations with Stephanie, my wife, about what is the, publicly showing things and privately showing things. And, I guess at the beginning, I thought of, I've always been very influenced by cinema, by the movies. I kind of live kind of like by the, Bible of cinema, and it's sort of what knowledge it really brings to you in terms of the scripts, and I think that I really like the idea of showing work publicly. I mean, I once saw a Fred Astaire film called Daddy Longlegs. It's a great, great film, great, song and dance film, and it's about this guy who lives in a museum, and he lives on the top floor, and he was, sort of a man about town, but his family really collected all these great master paintings, but he never really paid much of attention to it. And then you see how he kind of grows into it, and how he becomes really involved with art, and how it's a great film. So I guess I started with something silly like that, and liking the idea, and then it developed as I got to know more artists and more, people like yourself. I just, just thought I liked the idea of doing shows. I thought museums are all great, but they all lack something. And there's always a position open to improve, So I guess that's how I started. And as I started, and, with Stephanie, we really learned to like it. What you learn from sports is to be competitive. So being competitive is something that you need to be if you're going to collect, because you got to go out there and get it, And
those days of when you were a teen, being able to get any work you want.
I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I don't believe
You
that.
think there's still works out there?
Yeah, I mean, you have young artists downstairs.
Yeah, Emilio Martinez.
Looks great, and I mean, it's just, it's. I don't think history changes, and if you go back in history, there's Velázquez and Goya and court painters that were always great because they were so skilled. But if you look at the abstract expressionists, where did they come from? It's. I think there's always young talent, and that young talent, some of them become old talent.
You have approximately how many Warhols?
I promise you I couldn't tell you.
You couldn't? Okay. So
I really couldn't. I just don't.
The show that you're opening in a few weeks has about 100 in it.
Yeah, I can tell you one thing. The last Warhol I bought was only a month ago, so it's like,
So how did you, in your thinking for this exhibition that's coming up, how did you make that selection, and is there a particular focus in the subject of this exhibition? The title is 30 is
30 are better than one.
And that comes from a Warhol.
That comes from a famous Warhol painting, Mona Lisa, 30 times, based on the Dada, principle of, it's like, nothing. It's that 30 Mona Lisas are better than looking at one. That's
repetition
Andy's,
of the image.
Yeah, that's Andy's influence of Marcel Duchamp, is from Marcel Duchamp. So Andy always thought that painting was one of his greatest works, and I've always thought it was one of his greatest works.
Probably one of the lesser known, too.
Probably
the most meaningful in thinking about it.
For the public, maybe. I think for Warhol connoisseurs, not. They know the work. That it was a work that was very dear to me. I mean, I bought it in Africa, and it was really amazing that we got that work. And I got it in Africa because the person who bought it in Paris for Emiliana Sonnabend moved to Africa because her husband was in the diamond business. So that's why it was in Africa. But and it was a great collection that it was in. So that painting is in the show, and it's a wonderful work of art. But as far as hanging the show, it's like a very easy thing for me to do because it's my whole life, and I've lived it, and it's not something I have any kind of block doing, and my family is also very supportive and helped me a lot. Stephanie herself is a collector of his work, and she, by this time, certainly knows, Andy's work as well as anyone. And so my daughter, Allison, is very involved in the foundation, and Dylan, my son, and Chris, and Kelly runs the Interview magazine. So it's really a family thing. But in terms of hanging the show, and it's a beautiful space in New York. lends itself very well. Basquiat lived right there. Andy lived, had a building right there. And the factory was very close. So it all kind of lives there. And it's a wonderful show. I mean, not because I had a lot to do with it or something to do with it. It's really a great, thing, because with Warhol shows in the past, everybody has always shown the early work and then dealt with the later work not having 40 years or 35 years of experience looking at it. You know how artists' work change after they've been in circulation for 30 years. So this hanging, really works for the older work and the earlier work and the 70s middle work very nicely.
Yeah. And you also have The Last Supper.
The 32-foot Last Supper is there.
But I think, and you touched on it a little bit, that Andy was very religious.
Very religious.
So when he did The Last Supper, it wasn't ironic. This was a real statement on his part.
Yeah, he was very sick. He had a problem with his gallbladder, and he just was asked to do these pictures. They were very religious pictures, and they also reminded him a great deal of his earlier work, which was very influenced by, by the religious aspect, the icons of the Russian church. I mean, his parents were from Bohemia, but he went, regularly to church. He was, he was very religious, and he was working on this. It was Alexander Yolis's idea to do the Last Supper, and he got a lot of ideas from different people, and so he worked on this, to have these paintings across from where the Last Supper actually is in Milan. So he went there, was not feeling well at all, and he had to go to the hospital to be operated on, and he never came out.
You just saw the exhibition in Paris
Yeah, I was
of
there.
Warhol and Basquiat. It was interesting to hear the interview with Bischofberger talking about how he was encouraging them with this idea of the exquisite corpse, which was a game that the surrealists played. They would fold up paper, and one artist would draw a head and then fold it, and the next one would draw something else, and then when they were done, they'd have this monster, and that's kind of what Bischofberger had in mind when he put the two together.
Right.
What did you think of that exhibition?
I thought it was really very interesting to see the work. I mean, there's probably 100 different works that they did in that series, and maybe they had 90 of those works there. Maybe it should have been edited a little bit more, but that show is coming to our foundation in New York in October.
Oh, wow.
And it's also going to be in Connecticut, and half in Connecticut and half in the East Village. And I think that it's a great show. We don't know why they worked together. I mean, a lot of people claim different things, but certainly they were very close friends. And Andy really cared a lot about Jean-Michel, and Jean-Michel lived in a house that Andy rented to him, and they were very close. And I think that those artists like Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf and Jean-Michel Basquiat, those were kind of like the young kids, and they got Andy Warhol's blood going again, and that's why you see a lot of that very strong work
And he started painting he did one, and Warhol painted actually painted rather than silk screen.
Yeah, this is the big hand-painted one
Yeah,
that's there. Yeah.
that was new. There is a continuity in relationship between the artists that you collect. I mean, if you think of Warhol and Lichtenstein as your starting point, and Franz Klein, there's almost right there you could understand the trajectory forward. Do you see a connection? How did one lead to another?
I see the connection, but I think sometimes sometimes you get there by accident. And then, a lot of people look at it and say, well, this is connected in some way, and it winds up being connected. But like, I loved Franz Klein. But the reason that I loved Franz Klein was, when I was just a teenager, I used to watch television. I used to watch Playboy After Dark.
As a teenager.
As a teenager, because
I didn't even know that was on television.
It was on television, and it really was. Hugh Hefner had an apartment, and they televised the parties that he would give there, but it was all staged. And I remember there was a great Franz Klein in that apartment, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. So there was nothing really intellectual about it other than I heard great jazz. I saw Franz Klein painting. I saw a de Kooning painting behind the bar of a woman de Kooning, which was incredible.
Wow.
And, he collected art, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. So it was accidental, but I at least had the taste to recognize that it was cool.
So in other words, you read Playboy for the articles.
I mean, they're great articles too, but I can't say that I was an avid reader of them.
But I see a pattern here, because the first thing you had mentioned was the Fred Astaire movie, in which Fred Astaire lives in this home with the collection. I have to say, I was looking at the dancing. I have to go back and look at the movie now and look at the art. And now you have this other example. It's like your life was being mediated through the media, through film, through publications, that you had this idea that this is how sophisticated people live, in a way. Or it was the world you want to inhabit.
Or let's say creative people. I mean, we kind of thought in the 50s and early 60s, we kind of thought of Hugh Hefner was circled by a lot of intellectual, Ginsberg, people like that. So, whether it was by accident, whether it was to promote the magazine, who knows? But it was there, and it's part of our culture.
You've had such an impact on discourse, art discourse, the art world. All of that's changed. I mean, you see it more than anybody, how much the discourse has changed, the criticism. What would you say is the difference from when you were starting with magazines and today?
Well, for me, it is kind of, I think that the art world is so much bigger today. People, they dissect things so much quicker. Everybody has an opinion, and they should have an opinion, but it's out there, whether it's on the internet or whatever it is, and it might affect people short-term and not long-term, or vice versa. It might be great short-term and terrible long-term. I think an artist has to really create what, it's changed in that artists don't spend as much time with each other discussing their work. Everything is competitive, and it's all like, who makes a deal with this one and who makes a deal with that one. And, I think that artists need to have that discourse, and that's how great movements have always existed.
It's interesting. That's one of the areas that I've been focusing on in some of my curation and writing is these relationships between artists and how important it is. And one of the things in South Florida that we've played a role is being a catalyst to bring all these different artists together, both those that are here and from outside, to have that opportunity to learn from each other and form a real collective or a sounding boards that you wouldn't have otherwise, and it's so important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting.
That's what I mean. In New York, you had people like Leo Castelli who really were part of that. They really encouraged that, and certainly the New York School.
It was all on friendships, and right now I'm working on the color field artists who are lumped together critically as color field artists, but it really was this relationship between a whole group of artists, the same time as the pop artists, working out certain problems of space and color in their work, and they were very much a dialogue between each other, and that's how it developed.
Did Warhol understand which of his works were more significant and why when he was making them?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so. I mean, he just was so conscious of everything he did. It's just that, he really came off like almost, like a savant. I mean, he was very standoffish when it came to talking, to people. He didn't really say much. So if you spent a lot of time around him, you saw his sense of humor, and you saw, he had everything. He was really bright and one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. He was a good businessman. He was a good everything. He was a very special person. If you knew him and you spent some time with him, you would start noticing the buildings around you when you walk down the street. You would never, maybe as a kid, you would never even really look at them. But when you were around him, you would, and he wouldn't like lecture to you, hey, look at that. It would just come out of his mouth by him studying it, and you look at what he was studying, and you could see, it might be a cornice, or it might be some detail that really sent him. And I think he knew, very much so how great an artist he was, and I think he also knew how great a filmmaker he was. And he was much more known, like in the 60s, if you got off a plane with him in Rome or Milan, you couldn't believe how many people, just thought he was a film god, as a avant-garde filmmaker. So I think he just was not, he was not very close to the art world. I mean, he loved other artists, that he liked them very, very much. He was very close to Jasper Johns, to Teenie Duchamp. He was, Philip Johnson. He was really always amongst very creative people, but he himself, I think, really knew how great his work was.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you have just purchased a Warhol piece about a month ago. What were the circumstances? Was it a piece that you've been following? It was one that you'd had your eye on, or is it something just new to you? With the number that you have, what motivated you to buy that one a month ago?
It was something that I'd always thought was one of his greatest paintings, and I always was, looking for a painting from that series, and never really had the opportunity, or if I did try to acquire it. It just, wasn't reachable for me. It was not possible. So yeah,
Which work was it?
I can't say.
Oh, okay. Is it going to be in the shelf?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay.
First, thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and I'm here. Oh, and your experiences with us. Through your years of collecting art, is there a book or exhibition that you visited that really influenced you and still speaks to you today?
Yes, there is. There was a show that I saw in 1969, and it was called The New York School from 1940 to 1970, even though it was 1969. And it was at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and it was held in the classical galleries of the museum where all the old master paintings were. And Henry Geltzoller was the director of the museum. He later became the park superintendent of, he was in charge of the New York parks. And he chose, with his curators, he chose 40 artists' work from 1940 to 1970. And a lot of input came from different, gallerists and collectors, and the Met decided who the artist would be, and they chose usually 4 or 5 works by each artist. So there were 150 to 200 works, and it was just incredible. I mean, it was 1969, maybe the most expensive work, would have been, the average work would have probably been more like $15,000, and the most expensive would have been, say, $50,000 or $60,000, which of course in 1969 is a lot more than it is today with inflation. But the works in that show were so incredible that if you looked at those works today, you'd say, oh my God, they're just, every choice was like right on. And so many great masterpieces. You had all the artists there. The only artist you could find that was not there, that as I look at it now, I always say, well, why wasn't he there, was Cy Twombly. He was not included, but everybody else was included. I mean, Pollock, de Kooning, Warhol, Judd, Flavin, just everybody that you could think of. And I thought that was such an encouraging thing for New York and for the United States, because it was all American. There were no, it was just the New York school. So although there were California artists, included. So that show was a major, major show. But the catalog for that show was, like that high, had maybe 5 or 6 colored photographs in it, and the rest was all black and white. And I think it's very indicative of what's happened to the art world from all the way back in 1969 to the present, where a show like that would have volumes of colored photographs.
Well, it was expensive to print in color
Yeah,
in those days.
it's true, but the size of the
Yeah, it was good.
and the text is great. I suggest for anyone to buy that book. It's really, really wonderful. The show was incredible.
Yeah, and it was an important show for the artists. I know it really was the meeting or the transition from the abstract expressionist generation to the next. Frank Stella, this was 1969, so he's 23 years old, and Rothko came up to him at the opening, because Frank was just
Right.
had the show at MoMA and group show, and Frank said that Rothko asked him to come see him. And
Yeah.
so this idea that, the two generations were actually meeting and connecting, they hadn't met before.
Thank you for coming. I have a question about ETF and the ETF art world. Is this something you're looking into, and what are your thoughts of its future?
Oh, and what was it?
ETFs?
NFT?
NFTs, sorry.
NFT. Well, I've seen some that I really like. My wife and I saw, we had a show of David Sally. There was an NFT in that show, and we really liked it. But I can't, I understand what each artist is trying to do, but I just don't, I don't feel comfortable myself that anybody's really gotten to the place that it's going to wind up, that it's more in a transition, and I just don't feel qualified to, it's not my, I don't have the knowledge to really decipher whether something is great or it's not great, because I've never been involved in it.
Bonnie and Peter, that was awesome. Peter, apropos the Met show that you had just mentioned, I just think it's interesting that was almost 20 years after the famous letter and the photograph of the Irascibles. And just showing how slowly time moved then and how
Yes.
quickly it moves now. But my question to you, Peter, is did your dad witness your collecting? Did you have conversations? What did he say when you brought home a Warhol?
My dad and I were very close, and we influenced each other in some way. Him a lot more than influenced me, a lot more than I influenced him. But I did influence him in collecting contemporary American art, and he did collect it. And he loved 30 or better than one. That was like, he loved that painting. He didn't really understand, he just called it Mona. But he loved the painting, and he collected, he had a few Oldenburgs, and he had a couple of things of Andes, and he was very proud of at least that I was interested in art, and he came around to understanding that it was, like to my dad, Picasso was like too modern for him. But he came around, and he really enjoyed it. Came to a lot of the shows, and he, unfortunately, we lost him in 1995. But he was great.
Hi, thank you again for your insight, and especially regarding Warhol. It was wonderful to hear your take, and I definitely appreciate your support of later Warhol. I think the business art is the best art. And I wanted to ask maybe an unpleasant question, but is there a piece that sticks with you that you passed on, or something that keeps you up at night, like a work that you maybe turned down that you think about still?
There's a line exactly like that in Paint.
Oh, yeah.
where
Yep.
they ask Owen Wilson the same question, So is there anything that keeps me up at night when I think about the work?
Or more like regrets of purchases that you maybe,
Something you missed.
something that got away.
The woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Oh, yeah, so my family is always telling me that I really should do a show about the works that I either sold or they just slipped away. I didn't, I almost got it but didn't get it. Or just the ones that I've sold. Because when you go out and you buy these paintings, you got to sell, it's just, I at least had to sell a lot of things in order to be able to get the things that I was acquiring. And I think it's interesting that if I did that, it would be very, very close to as good as the collection that I wound up with. So it just means that there were a lot of great works that went through our hands, and I don't care. I mean, I loved being involved in them. I mean, it was great. But yeah, there's a lot of ones that most people would lose sleep over. But I don't let that bother me. I'm just happy that I was lucky enough to be around some very, very great works by many great artists.
Well, you touched upon this several times, but I wanted to dig a little deeper, just out of curiosity. So you're 16, 17 years old, buying your first painting, obviously heavily influenced by your father, took you around museums. But when you started to buy those first couple of paintings, what were you thinking in your head at the time as to what your goal was? I mean, did you think that you're going to become one of the great collectors of all time? Did you think that you were just buying something that looked nice over your bed, or you were going to make money off it? What was driving you when you made those first couple of purchases?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say all three, but I don't know. I wasn't buying art at 16. I was buying art really at 17 and 18.
I'm not sure that's a material difference.
He wasn't that precocious.
Yeah, I think when I bought that Marilyn, I was 18 years old.
Oh my God.
So 18 or 19. But I definitely thought it was a good investment.
When you were 18, you knew that?
Yes, because the artists were famous artists. It wasn't like they were unknown. A lot of people always say to me, well, how did you recognize them? I mean, they were famous artists. They just were not taken seriously. Andy Warhol did the soup can paintings. Everybody in the world knew about the soup can paintings. But most people thought it was a joke. Nobody bothered to study the characters, study the movement. Just most serious collectors just took it as a joke, and most museum people took it as a joke. Otherwise, we would have had many more shows in America, and we would have had many more paintings here. Great paintings. So I knew that it was in demand in Europe when I started buying it. So I had the confidence. I wasn't going in there like my father thought I was. Like, what are you doing? This is like crazy.
That was probably the big difference, was that you were in Europe.
Yeah.
And had that exposure as opposed to other collectors. And people didn't travel like they travel now. It was so New York centric at that time.
Yeah.
So that experience of being in Europe and exposed to people who did recognize the importance.
Yes, exactly.
I think that made the big difference.
Exactly, and also in 1968, 69, 67, there weren't that many collectors of this kind of work. There really weren't. I mean, you could really count them on two hands. So it was, these are artists doing hundreds of works. And there's only 7, 8 collectors. I mean, there were, the Tremaines, the Skulls, the Ganses.
Barron.
I mean, maybe Rowan in California. There just weren't that many. There were a lot of European collectors, but not that many American collectors. Sometimes you're too close to the forest to see the trees, And that's what happens. A movement, I guess the same thing happened in France with Cubism.
Well, once again, thank you very much for the exhibition, to Peter, Brant, and Stephanie. I think it's wonderful, and we have learned so much. But you were saying that when you were young, you were influenced by Leo Castelli, or in a way he was able to kind of like probably allow you to see things that you already were seeing inside of you, but they just kind of like give you that confidence, like, I'm going the right way. What about your friends or your contemporaries? Do you have friends that they saw you were doing and they kind of like was like, you're doing something interesting and they did it themselves, or that didn't happen?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm the most proud of is the people that I have, been friendly with, that I've associated with, that have become great collectors, and that are wonderful collectors, and there are many of them, and I'm very proud of that, of that fact, that if you can pass on anything that is culturally strong in terms of their belief, that it's a good thing. But I just want to emphasize that it's not impossible to be a great collector, even if you're not the wealthiest person in the world. It's like, it's like this exhibition here, the clothes in that exhibition are, incredible. They're incredible works of art by great designers, masters of their craft. And, I think my wife, Stephanie, did not get hung up on her own fame, but instead went to that beauty of those dresses and those designers and the people that wore those dresses and bought those things 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they cost a quarter of what new clothes cost today. So, in time, I think people will look at costume, fashion, in a different kind of way. It just means like you don't have to throw everything you have out, away. It's some things are better than others. Some things are more important design than others. But at least the education of knowing about it and studying it is a fun thing to do. It's like when you're young and you're a boy and you collect baseball cards. It's, you could either go there for the bubble gum or you could look at the cards.
Quick question, because I joke with everyone that I'm the youngest dinosaur you ever met. I'm a 45-year-old dinosaur that's scared of technology. But I wanted your opinion on what we're hearing about AI and its ability to make art that looks like it was produced by a human. Because that intimidates me, but I wanted to know, someone at your level of collecting, is that being discussed now in your circles or not yet?
I've heard it discussed. It's certainly discussed in the movie business for sure, and I've heard that, but I think that it's just a technology. It needs a great artist to use that technology to make great art. It's like photography. It's just a medium, and then a great artist needs to turn that, they must use that and make it part of their work, and what the artist does is art.
Because I think you want to talk about it, I'm curious about why you decided to do the movie Paint.
Oh, good.
I mean, that's a great question. It has nothing to do with art it has nothing to do with art, the reason that I did it. So Owen Wilson is a very good friend of mine, and for many years. And Owen and I always talked. He's an art collector, and he and I have always talked about. I kind of help him with his art, advise him a little bit. But when you advise people, one thing you learn is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So he has a lot of knowledge now, so, and And when somebody gets started and they make some acquisitions and they work out, they quickly think they really know what they're doing. And some people do and some people don't. But Owen and I always talked about doing a movie together. And I thought we were going to do it on maybe gambling, or he's like very interested in gambling, and he would write a great script for a movie about the addiction of gambling. And then he found this Britt McAdams, who's a writer and director. He did the Mapplethorpe film, and he came up with a script that was in kind of demand in Hollywood about 7, 8 years ago. And he convinced Owen to do it, to play the Bob Ross character. And Bob Ross is a household name in TV, and those landscape paintings that he did. So we decided to make this movie, and Owen Wilson plays Bob Ross, and it's really a comedy, and it's very funny, and but it's not. I didn't do it for the same reason I did Pollock or Basquiat. It was very much different. It was just two friends doing a project. It was a very low budget, film, a lot of good acting, and it's doing well.